All set now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's go.
I thought she's banned. This can't be real. How is this possible?
Divorced for 7 years, ex-husband followed his ex-wife and finally found out. Distinguished viewers, welcome to Luxury True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more amazing real-life luxury stories. Now, let's get into the story. Jennifer Morgan grew up in a quiet neighborhood in Boston. Her father, Daniel Morgan, worked as a city bus driver, while her mother, Linda Morgan, was a gentlewoman who ran a small bakery from home. Jennifer was their only child, raised with warmth, discipline, and strong values. From a young age, she loved books, quiet parks, and long evening walks. Her dream was simple: to live a peaceful life, build a loving family, and become a respected editor in the publishing world. Richard Taylor lived in a completely different world. His father, William Taylor, owned a successful real estate empire, and his mother, Margaret Taylor, was known in elite social circles. Richard grew up surrounded by luxury, private schools, and high expectations. Despite the wealth, Richard often felt pressure to prove himself. He loved business, competition, and the thrill of success. Deep inside, however, he wanted something genuine, something not built on status. Their lives moved in separate directions for many years. Jennifer studied literature at university and worked part-time at a small bookstore. Richard studied business and was already preparing to join his father's company. Neither of them knew that very soon, on a rainy evening that would change everything, their two completely different worlds would finally collide. One cold autumn evening, heavy rain poured across the streets of Boston. Jennifer had just finished her shift at the small bookstore where she worked part-time while attending university. The streets were nearly empty, and the wind pushed rain against the glass windows of nearby cafes. She stood under the store's awning, holding her bag close while waiting for the rain to slow. Public buses were running late, and the street lights reflected on the wet pavement. At the same time, Richard Taylor was driving through the city after a long meeting at his father's office. Traffic moved slowly because of the storm. As he stopped at a red light, he noticed a young woman standing alone outside the bookstore, clearly waiting for the rain to ease. Something about her calm expression caught his attention. She didn't seem frustrated like the others rushing through the storm. Instead, she simply stood there patiently, watching the rain fall. After a brief moment of hesitation, Richard parked nearby and walked toward the awning. He politely asked if she needed a ride since the rain showed no sign of stopping. Jennifer hesitated at first, but his respectful tone made her feel safe enough to accept. During the short drive, their conversation was simple but warm. They spoke about the bookstore, university life, and the unpredictable weather. Neither of them realized it then, but that quiet ride through the rain had just begun a story that would change both their lives forever. After that rainy evening, Richard found himself thinking about Jennifer more often than he expected. Her calm personality and simple outlook on life were very different from the fast-paced world he lived in. A few days later, curiosity led him back to the same bookstore. The small shop smelled of fresh paper and coffee from a nearby cafe. Jennifer stood behind the counter organizing books, surprised when she saw him walk in. Richard greeted her with a friendly smile and pretended he was simply browsing for a book recommendation. Jennifer quickly realized he wasn't much of a reader, but she appreciated the effort. They spoke for nearly 30 minutes about novels, favorite authors, and the peaceful atmosphere of bookstores. Before leaving, Richard bought a book Jennifer suggested, even though he rarely had time to read. From that day forward, Richard began visiting the bookstore regularly. Sometimes he would bring coffee, other times they would walk around the nearby park after Jennifer finished work. Their conversations became longer and more personal. Jennifer shared stories about helping her mother in the bakery and her dream of working in publishing. Richard spoke about the pressure of joining his father's company and the constant expectations placed on him. Slowly, without either of them forcing it, a genuine friendship began to grow between two people from completely different worlds. As weeks passed, Richard and Jennifer's friendship naturally deepened. What started as casual visits to the bookstore slowly turned into planned meetings. Richard began adjusting his busy schedule just to spend time with her. They walked through quiet city parks, visited small cafes, and sometimes simply sat by the river talking for hours. Jennifer liked how Richard listened carefully whenever she spoke, while Richard admired Jennifer's calm and thoughtful nature. Jennifer eventually introduced Richard to her parents. Daniel Morgan welcomed him warmly, though he was slightly surprised to learn about Richard's wealthy background. Linda Morgan quickly liked Richard after noticing how respectfully he treated Jennifer. The small Morgan home was filled with laughter that evening as they shared a simple homemade dinner. For Richard, it was a completely different experience from the formal dinners he was used to attending with his family. Richard later invited Jennifer to a charity event hosted by his family. The grand ballroom, expensive decorations, and elegantly dressed guests made Jennifer feel slightly out of place at first. However, Richard stayed by her side the entire evening, making sure she felt comfortable. Margaret Taylor quietly observed Jennifer with curiosity, unsure whether this modest young woman truly belonged in their sophisticated world. Despite the differences surrounding them, Richard and Jennifer's feelings for each other had already grown stronger than either of them realized. Months passed, and the bond between Richard and Jennifer became impossible to ignore. Their friendship had slowly transformed into something deeper. Richard found comfort in Jennifer's calm presence after long days at the office, while Jennifer admired Richard's determination and the way he never gave up on his goals. One quiet evening in the city park where they often met, Richard finally confessed that he had fallen in love with her. Jennifer, who had secretly felt the same for months, gently admitted her feelings as well. Their relationship soon became serious. Richard spent more time at the Morgan family home, helping Daniel fix small things around the house and tasting Linda's fresh pastries from the bakery. Jennifer, on the other hand, gradually became more familiar with Richard's world. Although Margaret Taylor remained cautious about the relationship, William Taylor respected his son's decision and focused mainly on Richard's growing a role in the family business. After 2 years of dating, Richard proposed to Jennifer during a quiet evening dinner overlooking the city lights. Jennifer was overwhelmed with emotion as she accepted. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, combining both families and friends. Jennifer wore a modest white dress, while Richard promised to always protect and support her. As they began their new life together, both believed their love was strong enough to face any challenge the future might bring. Neither of them knew that unexpected trials were already waiting ahead. Marriage brought new routines into Richard and Jennifer's lives. They moved into a modern apartment in downtown Boston, not far from Richard's company headquarters. Jennifer continued working toward her dream of becoming an editor, while Richard spent long hours learning every detail of the real estate business under his father's guidance. Life seemed steady and hopeful during the first year of their marriage. Richard's responsibilities at the company grew quickly. William Taylor trusted him with larger projects, important meetings, and negotiations with investors. Because of the increasing workload, Richard often returned home late at night. Jennifer understood his ambition and supported him, but the long hours sometimes left her feeling lonely in the quiet apartment. Around this time, a new employee joined the company. Her name was Helen Charles. She was confident, intelligent, and very ambitious. Helen had a strong reputation in corporate management and quickly became one of the most efficient employees in the office. Richard noticed her professionalism immediately during their first meeting. What began as a normal working relationship would slowly grow into something far more complicated, though none of them fully understood the consequences yet. Helen Charles quickly became an important presence in Richard's office. She was highly organized, confident in meetings, and always seemed to anticipate problems before they happened. Her sharp business mind impressed William Taylor as well, and soon she was assisting Richard with several major projects. Helen often stayed late at the office reviewing documents and preparing reports, which meant she and Richard began spending long hours working together. Jennifer noticed that Richard's schedule was becoming even busier than before. Some evenings he returned home exhausted, speaking mostly about deadlines, investors, and company expansion. Jennifer tried to remain supportive, reminding herself that this demanding period was part of Richard building his future. Still, the quiet apartment sometimes felt lonelier than it had before. At the office, Helen gradually became more comfortable around Richard. She praised his leadership, admired his ambition, and often encouraged him during stressful meetings. Richard appreciated the support, especially during difficult negotiations. What he didn't realize was that Helen had begun developing a deeper interest in him. For her, the line between professional respect and personal attraction was slowly beginning to blur. Over time, the long hours at the office began creating distance between Richard and Jennifer. Richard often returned home late, sometimes after Jennifer had already fallen asleep. When they did spend time together, their conversations were shorter and often centered around work. Jennifer tried to hide her disappointment, reminding herself that Richard was under pressure to succeed in his father's company. Meanwhile, Helen's presence in Richard's daily life continued to grow. She handled important files, attended meetings beside him, and frequently joined him for late-night discussions about business strategies. Helen understood Richard's ambitions very well, and she knew exactly how to encourage him. Her compliments were subtle but constant, making Richard feel respected and supported during stressful moments. Jennifer began sensing that something in their marriage had changed. Richard seemed distracted and distant, even during their dinners together. One evening, while Richard was answering yet another work call at the dinner table, Jennifer quietly watched him with concern. She didn't know exactly what was wrong yet, but deep inside she felt that their once peaceful life together was slowly beginning to slip away. The tension in Richard and Jennifer's marriage continued to grow quietly. Jennifer tried to stay positive and patient, believing the busy season at Richard's company would eventually pass. However, Richard was becoming more distant with each passing week. His phone rang constantly, and many of the calls seemed to come from Helen regarding urgent work matters. Jennifer never accused him of anything, but the uneasiness in her heart slowly deepened. One evening, Jennifer decided to surprise Richard by bringing dinner to his office. She carefully packed a small meal and drove to the company building, hoping they could spend a little time together. The office floor was nearly empty when she arrived. As she walked toward Richard's office, she noticed soft voices coming from inside. When she gently pushed the door open, she saw Richard and Helen standing unusually close while discussing documents. The moment was brief but uncomfortable. Both Richard and Helen immediately stepped apart when they noticed Jennifer at the door. Richard quickly explained that they had simply been working late on an important contract. Jennifer forced a small smile and handed him the dinner she brought. Although nothing openly inappropriate had happened, the atmosphere felt strange and tense. As Jennifer left the office building at night, a quiet doubt settled deeply in her heart. The uneasy feeling Jennifer carried that night did not disappear. Over the following weeks, Richard's distance became even more noticeable. He often stayed at the office late, sometimes returning home long after midnight. When Jennifer asked about his long hours, Richard simply said the company was handling several important projects. Jennifer tried to trust him, but the quiet doubts in her mind kept growing. One evening, while Richard was taking a shower after returning from work, his phone buzzed repeatedly on the table. Jennifer had never been the type to check his messages, but the constant notifications caught her attention. The name Helen Charles appeared again and again. The messages were not about business meetings or documents. Instead, they were personal and far too familiar. In that moment, the painful truth became impossible to ignore. When Richard came out of the bathroom, Jennifer calmly asked him about Helen. At first he tried to dismiss her concerns, but Jennifer showed him the messages she had seen. The silence that followed felt heavy. Richard eventually admitted that his relationship with Helen had crossed a line. The confession shattered Jennifer's trust completely. That night, the peaceful marriage they had once built together finally collapsed under the weight of betrayal. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Jennifer barely spoke, moving through the apartment quietly as she tried to process the betrayal. Richard attempted to explain himself several times, saying the relationship with Helen had started as a mistake during a stressful period at work. But every word only deepened Jennifer's pain. For her, trust had been broken in a way that could not easily be repaired. Jennifer eventually made a difficult decision. She packed a few of her belongings and returned to her parents' home. Daniel and Linda Morgan welcomed her without questions, immediately understanding that their daughter was going through something deeply painful. Jennifer spent long hours helping her mother in the bakery again, trying to focus on small routines while her heart slowly healed. Within weeks, Jennifer filed for divorce. Richard tried calling her repeatedly, asking for another chance, but Jennifer remained firm in her decision. The legal process moved quickly. When the papers were finally signed, their marriage officially ended. The two people who once believed their love could survive anything now walked away from each other, unaware that life still held unexpected turns neither of them could yet imagine. Life moved in completely different directions for Richard and Jennifer after the divorce. Jennifer chose to start over in a quieter city called Portland. With the help of a former university professor, she found a position at a small but respected publishing company. The change of environment helped her slowly rebuild her confidence and independence. She focused on her work, spent time reading and writing, and avoided anything that reminded her of the painful chapter she had left behind. Richard, on the other hand, threw himself deeper into work. After the divorce, he spent almost every day at the company office, trying to distract himself from the loneliness that followed him home each night. Helen Charles became more present in his life during that time. Since the truth about their relationship was no longer hidden, she openly stayed by his side. Many colleagues assumed they would eventually become a permanent couple. For a while, Richard believed moving forward with Helen would help him forget the past. They attended business events together and traveled for company projects. But even during those moments, a quiet emptiness followed him. The life he once shared with Jennifer, the simple dinners, peaceful conversations, and warmth of her family, sometimes returned to his thoughts when he least expected it. Still, he convinced himself that the past was gone and that there was no turning back. Several years passed as Richard continued building his career alongside Helen. The company expanded, new projects were completed, and Richard gradually became one of the most recognized figures in the business world his father had created. On the surface, everything seemed successful. Expensive suits, large meetings, and constant travel filled his life, yet the quiet sense of emptiness never truly disappeared. Helen enjoyed the lifestyle that came with Richard's growing influence. She attended business dinners, social gatherings, and corporate events where she was often introduced as Richard's partner. However, her interest in Richard was closely tied to his success. She admired ambition and stability, and as long as Richard's life remained strong and secure, she stayed confidently beside him. One winter evening, while driving back from an important meeting outside the city, Richard's life suddenly changed. Heavy snow covered the highway, and visibility became poor. A truck ahead lost control on the icy road, forcing several vehicles to brake suddenly. Richard's car collided violently during the chain reaction of crashes. The accident was severe. Emergency crews arrived quickly, and Richard was rushed to the hospital with serious injuries. That single moment on the icy highway would quietly reshape the rest of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. Richard spent several weeks in the hospital recovering from the accident. His injuries were serious, and doctors had to perform multiple procedures to stabilize his condition. During those long days in the hospital room, the once busy businessman suddenly faced a stillness he had not experienced in years. Machines hummed quietly beside his bed while nurses moved in and out checking his recovery. After some time, one of the doctors had a difficult conversation with him. The injuries from the accident had caused permanent damage that affected his ability to have children in the future. The news shocked Richard deeply. For a long time he stared silently at the hospital window, trying to process what this meant for his life. It was not something he had ever imagined facing. At first, Helen continued visiting him at the hospital, bringing flowers and speaking about how things would return to normal once he recovered. But as the weeks passed and the full reality of Richard's condition became known, her visits became less frequent. Eventually, one day she simply stopped coming. A short message arrived on his phone explaining that she needed to focus on her own life and future. Richard realized that the person he had once chosen over his wife had now quietly walked away when things became difficult. After leaving the hospital, Richard returned to a much quieter life. The large apartment that once felt comfortable now seemed empty and cold. Without Helen and without the constant rush of work, his evenings became long and silent. He still managed parts of the company, but he no longer had the same energy or excitement he once carried. The accident had changed him both physically and emotionally. One afternoon, nearly 7 years after his divorce, Richard stopped at a small cafe while walking through a quiet part of the city during a business trip. As he waited for his coffee near the window, someone passing outside caught his attention. It was a familiar face he had not seen in years. Jennifer Morgan walked calmly along the sidewalk, carrying a bag and speaking gently to a young boy walking beside her. Richard froze for a moment as he watched them through the glass. Jennifer looked slightly older, but just as calm and graceful as he remembered. The young boy beside her laughed at something she said, holding her hand as they walked. Richard felt an unexpected wave of emotions, regret, curiosity, and confusion. Without fully thinking about it, he left the cafe and quietly followed them from a distance, unaware that this small decision would soon reveal something that would completely shock him. Richard followed them carefully along the quiet street, making sure to keep a distance so Jennifer would not notice him. His heart beat faster with every step. It had been 7 long years since he had last seen her, and suddenly she was right there in front of him again, walking peacefully through the afternoon sunlight. The boy beside her looked around 7 years old, energetic and curious as he pointed excitedly at different things along the street. Jennifer and the boy eventually stopped at a small neighborhood park. Richard stood near a tree across the walkway, pretending to check his phone while watching them. Jennifer sat on a wooden bench while the boy ran toward the playground. For several minutes, Richard simply observed them quietly. The boy climbed the slide, laughed loudly, and waved back toward Jennifer each time he completed another run down the slide. As Richard watched more closely, something about the boy suddenly caught his attention. The child's face, the shape of his eyes, and even the way he smiled felt strangely familiar. Richard frowned slightly as he continued watching. The resemblance felt too strong to ignore. Confusion filled his mind as the thought slowly formed. The boy looked remarkably similar to him when he was younger. The idea felt impossible, yet the more he watched the child, the harder it became to dismiss the unsettling possibility forming in his thoughts. Richard remained near the park for a long time, quietly observing from a distance. The boy continued playing while Jennifer patiently watched from the bench. Every movement of the child made Richard's thoughts grow louder. The way the boy tilted his head while laughing, the sharp shape of his eyes, even the small dimple that appeared when he smiled, it all felt strangely familiar. Richard could not ignore the resemblance any longer. Eventually Jennifer called the boy back to the bench. The child ran toward her excitedly, and she gently brushed the dust from his jacket while speaking to him softly. Richard slowly moved closer, his mind racing with questions. When Jennifer stood up and began walking out of the park with the boy, Richard finally gathered the courage to approach them. "Jennifer," he called carefully. Jennifer stopped walking. When she turned and saw Richard standing a few steps away, surprise immediately filled her face. For a moment neither of them spoke. The boy looked curiously between them. Richard's eyes moved again toward the child, and the resemblance struck him even more clearly. His voice became unsteady as he asked the question that had been growing inside him since the moment he first saw them. "Jennifer, who is this boy?" Jennifer stood still for a moment after hearing Richard's question. The sudden appearance of her former husband after so many years had clearly caught her off guard. The boy beside her looked up curiously, holding her hand while quietly observing the tense moment between the two adults. Jennifer took a slow breath, trying to steady herself before speaking. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the child. The resemblance he had noticed earlier now felt impossible to ignore. His voice grew softer but filled with emotion. "Jennifer. He looks exactly like me." The words came out slowly, almost as if he was afraid to say them out loud. Jennifer looked down briefly before meeting Richard's eyes again. After a short silence, Jennifer finally explained the truth she had carried for years. She told him that after their divorce, she had later discovered she was pregnant. At that time, their marriage had already ended, and she believed the best decision was to move forward and raise the child on her own without bringing more conflict into Richard's life. The boy, she explained, was named Daniel Morgan, after her father. Richard listened quietly, the weight of her words settling deeply in his heart as he realized that the child standing before him was truly his son. Richard stood in silence after hearing Jennifer's words. The realization that he had a son, one he had never known about for 7 years, filled him with overwhelming emotions. Regret pressed heavily on his chest as he looked at the young boy standing beside Jennifer. All the years he had wasted, all the mistakes he had made, suddenly felt even heavier. "Jennifer. I didn't know," Richard said quietly. His voice carried genuine remorse. "If I had known, I would have been there." Jennifer listened calmly, but her expression remained guarded. She had spent years raising Daniel on her own, building a peaceful life far away from the pain Richard once caused her. Hearing his regret did not erase those difficult years. Richard looked at his son again, his eyes filled with emotion. The boy watched him with innocent curiosity, unaware of the complicated history between the two adults. Richard slowly spoke again, asking Jennifer for a chance to be part of Daniel's life. He also apologized deeply for the betrayal that destroyed their marriage. Over the following weeks, Richard continued reaching out respectfully, asking for forgiveness and patiently waiting, hoping Jennifer would eventually allow him to make things right. Weeks slowly passed after that unexpected meeting in the park. Richard kept his promise to Jennifer and remained patient. Instead of forcing his way back into their lives, he respectfully asked for small chances to see Daniel. At first, Jennifer was cautious. The wounds from the past had taken years to heal, and she did not want anything to disturb the peaceful life she had built for her son. Still, she could see that Richard's regret was sincere. Gradually, Jennifer allowed Richard to spend short moments with Daniel. They met at the park, walked through quiet streets, and sometimes shared simple lunches at small cafes. Daniel quickly grew comfortable around him. Richard discovered that his son loved drawing, building small models, and asking endless curious questions about everything around him. Each moment Richard spent with Daniel filled him with both happiness and the painful awareness of the years he had missed. Over time, Jennifer noticed something she had not expected. Richard had changed. He was calmer, more thoughtful, and far more humble than the man she once knew. One evening, after watching Richard patiently help Daniel fix a small toy airplane, Jennifer finally spoke honestly with him. She told him forgiveness would take time, but she was willing to allow a new beginning for the sake of their son. For Richard, those words meant everything. The mistakes of the past could never be erased, but slowly, with patience and sincerity, a new chapter of their lives was beginning. And that brings us to the end of today's story. The world of luxury often hides stories deeper than what meets the eye. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories on Luxury Jewel Life Stories. Until our next story, take care and stay tuned for more.